As the introduction shared, I direct WRI's Global Water Program. For those of you that aren't as familiar with World Resources Institute, we're a global research organization. We work at the intersection of development and the environment. We have 1,400 staff working in over 50 countries. I'm based in our global Washington, D.C. office. So let me dive right in. I would say that we find ourselves at a very interesting moment in time, to say the least, as the world struggles to emerge from the global pandemic, as climate change impacts grow, even while we're distracted by other more pressing matters or what feel like more pressing matters, as conflict erupts in places like Myanmar and Ethiopia, and as recent elections in the US, thank goodness, and forthcoming elections in Europe, in Germany, France, Scotland, elsewhere, bring new opportunities, they also bring uncertainties. And so in this same very tumultuous time in the world, quietly water stress and water scarcity, which in fact underpin all of these concerns, continue to receive very little attention. Today I wanted to share my thoughts on the Global Water Challenge, and in particular why water stress is such a critical issue. That'll be what I really focus on today. But also share the fact that solutions exist. We know the things to do, we need to apply them. And then share a few reflections on my thoughts on opportunities for EU policymakers. And I very much look forward then to the discussion and questions afterward on that score. So the problem, we face this global water challenge and it has sort of three dimensions, which I'll get into. Water stress is the too little water dimension of that, and it's got some very important components that are necessary for us to understand, and has big impacts on people and economies. So the first component of the Global Water Challenge is the too much component. We know that we're seeing increasing storms and increasing extreme precipitation events around the world, and in fact now 80 to 90% of all disasters relate to water. Our own aqueduct floods tool, which we developed in partnership with Dutch research organizations, find that the number of people affected by floods will likely double by 2030. If we look at the frequency of extreme precipitation events, this is for Europe, if you look at the dark line, we're clearly seeing an increase in the historical record, and if we project forward using climate models, we continue to see other challenges. Sorry, I seem to be having some trouble here. There we go. On the too little water side, as many as 700 million people, according to WHO, are at risk of being displaced as a result of drought in the next 10 years. Nearly half the global population, live in potentially water-scarce areas, according to research by the UN and the World Bank. So this is not just a global south problem, this is a worldwide problem. And then, of course, we're too polluted as well. 80% of the world's wastewater is dumped without any treatment. And still today, over 2 million deaths occur every year, many of them children, from unsafe water-related diarrheal diseases. So we face really serious issues with respect to the global water challenge. The piece I want to focus on is how water stress, the too little water piece of it, is increasing. And just a quick moment of a reminder of your global hydrologic cycle education from school. We live in the water planet, right? There's a lot of water there, but very little of it, less than 3% of it, is in the form of fresh water. Of those resources, most of it, 70% of it, is locked up in ice caps and glaciers. That is, for as long as those last, that's rapidly changing. About a third of the available fresh water on the planet is in the form of groundwater, and relatively little, a very small percentage, is in lakes and streams and surface water. The way we use that is largely for agriculture, but a growing percentage is being used for industrial and urban and municipal purposes. That's growing actually quite rapidly. So what is this concept of global water stress? I just realized I'm not showing my full screen. I apologize. There we go. This is a screenshot of WRI's global water risk mapping tool called Aqueduct. It's a totally open source tool that uses the best available data, published data from around the world. So it's got global coverage, quite at a granular level, 10 kilometers square. There's now seeing zoomed out to the global level. But essentially when we talk about water stress, what we're talking about is the relationship between total demand for water and total available supply. So it's akin to your own household budget. How do we balance our income and expenses? What we're seeing is that in many places of the world, we are experiencing tremendous water stress, even in the same countries in particular areas. And in fact, we see that this is going to continue to grow in the future. This is starting to hit the news. A few years ago, Cape Town faced what was almost a day zero, where the taps would have run dry. Very serious concern. But what doesn't get as much attention is, number one, this is not just a one-off situation. This is likely to be less of an anomaly, the kind of drought that they were experiencing. And by the way, it was not only a very, very serious drought, but it was mismanagement of the water that they did have. We'll come back to that. But in 2019, the following year, what didn't get as much attention at all was that very similar situations, day zero situations, hit cities in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Ivory Coast, Morocco, Ghana. This has happened in Brazil in multiple cities. So we're going to be seeing more and more of these kinds of severe and historic water shortages. Again, it's not just a global south issue. Even in the Nordic countries, we can see these kinds of situations occur. So let me share with you some analysis that WRI did using our Aqueduct data set. Looked at the water supply and demand gap today and calculated forward to 2030, looking at different scenarios of how demand will increase and different scenarios of how climate may affect supply, as well as demand, because of course when it's warmer, we actually use more water. So we looked at that complex relationship. We used IPCC fifth assessment data. We're actually updating this data now to look at what's the total gap between water availability and water demand annually at the catchment level, those 15,000 10-kilometer square catchments that I described. And then we aggregated it up to countries and then globally. And what we come up with is a pretty stark picture. You'll often hear that there's a 30 or 40% water supply and demand gap. In fact, what we found is that we face a 56% deficit in water supply relative to demand in the next 10 years by 2030. When we look at the cost to meet the goals of the Sustainable Development Goals, SDG 6, on fresh water, which has multiple different facets of it, on access to water, on sanitation, on water quality, on this issue of water stress, on protection of natural resources. When we look at the costs associated with that to address those needs and bridge the gap to achieve the SDG goals, what we see is that it's actually that water scarcity piece, SDG 6.4, that target, that is 43% of the total costs to achieve the SDG goals. Just by way of comparison, though we know we need to make massive improvements in access to water and sanitation or WASH, and we need a lot more investment in that area, those costs are only 25%. So not only is this deficit huge, to address it and deal with the costs associated with it is also significant, and it only increases the longer that we delay. So I really want you to take away what a serious issue this is and how we have to start to take action now. This has a big impact on people and economies, of course. The World Bank has estimated that as much as 10% of GDP in certain countries could be at risk if we continue on a business as usual path, which is to treat water, fresh water, as if it's inexhaustible and it will never run out of it, as compared to more efficient water policies. Governments like India are seeing the effect of this already, and a quite startling report came out almost 3 years ago by Niti Aayog, the Indian National Planning Agency, in which it said as clearly as it could that India is suffering from its worst water crisis in its history, that by 2030 the country's water demand is projected to be twice the available supply. Severe water scarcity for hundreds of millions, and an eventual nearly 6% loss in the country's GDP. This woke me up. I look at these numbers all the time, but the fact that the government is actually acknowledging this and now develops its composite water management index report every year to try to get on top of that, is the first step. Governments then need to set limits, they need to create accountability mechanisms, but we'll come to that further. This is the picture we're looking at around much of the world. Just to add a little bit more texture to the picture, over half of the world's irrigated crops are already water stressed. That is, they're grown in areas of already high or extremely high water stress. So that means that most of the water that's available is already in use. In the case of a significant new water demand in those areas, or a bad drought, you can see what the impact can be. An interesting component of this also that relates is the globalization of water. We're seeing really significant shifts in virtual water trade around the world. There's been a real concentration of net exporters of virtual water and a growing number of net importers of food production, agriculture, foodstuffs, and the water that comes embedded in it. So what I mean by that is if you grow food in one place, all that water that's taken up to grow those crops, and then it's moved and sent to another part of the world, that's a virtual water trade. What we've seen is in the last 25 years, the virtual water trade in agriculture has doubled. So fewer and fewer places are able to grow their own food or enough, and so they're having to import it from elsewhere. Estimates are that that virtual water trade may triple by 2100. And also very alarming is that the non-renewable or kind of deep fossil water aquifer groundwater trading that's embedded in that virtual water trade may double. This is water that doesn't come back. It exists from, it was put in impermeable layers under the ground through glaciations and past geologic events. So we're seeing this in India, in parts of certainly the United States. We're kind of mining our bank accounts of water, if you will. And you can start to think about what the geopolitical issues are associated with this as well. The impact on the poor is enormous. The World Bank has done some really interesting analysis that shows that for a woman who was in a household when there was a bad drought in her area in infancy, she will have, as an adult, 8% lower household wealth. And her children will be of lower height and weight. So from one bad drought season, the implications ripple out through the generations. We're also seeing a real increase in water-related conflict. It doesn't mean that water causes the conflict necessarily. In some cases, that might be the case. But from data that has been compiled by Peter Glick at the Pacific Institute, we see an increase in the trend of incidences of violence associated with water resources and water systems clearly going up. Water is often an accelerator of underlying political tensions or other kinds of conflicts, economic issues, and so on. And in fact, today we have this early warning system tool and our Water, Peace, and Security, that's the WPS partnership with particularly Dutch partners, is attempting to get out ahead of those issues, to predict where some of these conflicts may be erupting, and to try to understand what the water-related dynamics of those are. So we can highlight both areas experiencing drought and other kinds of conflict. And what this is a picture of internally displaced people moving because of natural disasters, because of water-related factors, as well as other underlying conflict factors. And I just want to highlight here too, we worry a lot about displacement and migration from Africa to Europe and other parts of the world. And in fact, most of the displacement and the migration in Africa is intra-Africa, which does not mean that it's not destabilizing. Many of you might be familiar with the analysis that's been done of the period before the Syrian conflict, before the civil war. And one of the factors that exacerbated the tensions there was that farmers experienced an extreme drought for 3 years before the conflict erupted. They were forced to move to cities where they either couldn't find jobs or housing, or they were really had a very difficult time. Especially younger family members were radicalized, and so it added to the already very tumultuous and conflict-laden environment. And we see a lot of this that is continuing to happen. Most defense and national security agencies, of course, increasingly worried about climate, but they're increasingly worried about this water dimension as well. So as I've said, what are the things that are driving why this blue gap, this water stress situation is getting worse? And And it's really pretty simple if you want to break it down. It really comes down to the supply. There are the climate disruptions that I spoke about. A piece I haven't yet talked about, which is our rapid loss of the natural water systems, the forested watersheds, the wetlands, the small streams, the groundwater recharge zones that are either land use changes, they're farmed, they're paved over by urbanization. We're not paying attention to those aspects of our important natural infrastructure. On the demand side, we're seeing increasing competition across sectors. So not only is the overall demand for water increasing, but we're seeing, for example, energy demand for water going up. So the International Energy Agency predicts that energy water consumption will double by 2030, even as we move to more renewables. The actual amount of water that's used by those systems will increase. And then on the management side, and this is what it really comes down to, and this is what policymakers especially need to be paying attention to, we've really been sort of abdicating in most places in the world. We've been treating water as if it's inexhaustible, as if it's, a commons that we can all draw from until we have a tragedy. We don't price water in a way that actually measures or reflects its value, nor its actual cost to deliver, nor its marginal cost. So in many instances, the marginal cost curve, if you will, of water is set at a flat rate. In fact, when we run out of water, that cost curve goes vertical. We need to start pricing in those marginal costs. We have mismanagement of how water is allocated, and we lack good data and information and transparency and accountability of that. So these are the factors that are driving the higher water stress picture we see today. So that's the somewhat dire picture. But solutions do exist. We have answers at hand, and I want to speak to 3 areas of those. There are many other things we can focus on, but I wanted to focus today on these 3. Understanding risks, bringing supply and demand into better balance, and understanding that there are sustainable limits. We just need to set them, acknowledge them, and then investing in infrastructure that's more resilient with respect to water. So to the first piece about understanding risks. First, what we need to do is leapfrog the really significant data gaps that exist. In many parts of the world, there literally is almost no data about water resources. There's no observation network. We are flying essentially blind. Imagine if we had no information about disease outbreaks that could be shared across areas around the world. No information about weather systems. The reality is we're not going to be able to put into place the in situ, on-the-ground observation network, but we need more of that, in fact. But there are things that we can do with remote sense data that can fill some of those observation gaps. We need to start to make those investments. I think you've heard from WMO and others in the past that I'm sure that have gotten into more detail about this. We also need better near real-time models to understand water dynamics and where we have water and where we don't have it. We're getting to the point where we're able to do this more effectively. It's very complex with water because water moves around and it changes form. It's in the soil, it's in the air, in water vapor, and so on. But we actually have a lot of the models that we need to do this. What we need to do is start to bring together the best thinking from the European Space Agency, from NASA, from all the academics, from JRC and others, in a much more concerted way to create a global information system that allows us to track this more accurately. Once we have data, we need to make it more transparent. We need to make it available to people. This is something WRI has invested in a lot. These are some of the tools on our Aqueduct platform. The Water Risk Atlas is the one I've showed you the screenshots from before. We do country rankings. We have very detailed information on food and water scarcity, also on floods. These are all totally open source tools and they're in wide use. We need more of this kind of resource and information that's available to decision makers. And then we need to build in accountability mechanisms. There are a number of ways to do this. The first is through the SDG 6 reporting mechanism. So now all countries have to report against how they're doing on those 6 different dimensions. And I mentioned that water stress actually has its own target, 6.4, which looks at how well water supply and demand are being balanced and how efficient sectoral water use is. We need to use that information and hold governments to account. Another piece that I think is very promising is in the private sector. So we're already starting to see a significant shift. What the UK is now requiring, what the US government is likely to do with the Securities and Exchange Commission and through the US Treasury, requiring companies to start to really report on climate impacts. And I will just note that the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, actually takes in information from companies about water-related risks. And the most recent report, companies reported a financial impact from water risks. These are direct, experienced financial impacts of $300 billion in 2020. What they also noted is that the cost to address those risks, they estimate the companies at being the impact, is 5 times the cost of addressing them. I guess that's the point I want to raise, is that it's a 500% return on investment. But the key here is to start to force companies to report on this. We're doing some work with the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, with the EBRD, to actually create robust indicators of physical climate risk, including water indicators that could be applied for governments that are issuing bonds, to companies issuing stock, etc. So balancing water supply and demand, that's the second area where we need to be paying attention. And I'll just give a couple of examples here. Some of you might be familiar with China's attempts to address its really serious water challenges and other environmental challenges. So I think back in 2012, they issued an edict that China would now follow the so-called 3 red lines. They would look at water quality requirements, they would look at agricultural water productivity, how much water was going to agriculture for how much productivity of ag. And then the third piece was they would actually cap how much water per unit GDP they would expend by 2030. And what's interesting is we did some analysis with the government where we used our aqueduct data, and then we used Chinese data to ensure that we had the most accurate demand data. And we looked at a 15-year period at how water stress was increasing. And it's hard to really discern from these maps unless you can zoom in. We're actually seeing water stress increasing in a lot of places. And I would note that much of it is driven actually by coal-fired power, coal development. So that's interesting in light of what China's new commitments are on climate. But what we also noted was that in that period of time, since they set the 3 red lines, we've seen the rate of increase in China's water withdrawals slowing. So they still face water stress, but how that was increasing has actually been declining. Another example I will share is we're doing work with the government of Ethiopia, with the Ministry of Water Resources, and with the National Planning and Development Commission. To try to understand, we actually developed a water data system for them, looking at 77 sub-basins. They've never had a comparable and credible source of data across all of these different water basins, sub-basins. And then we looked at the different sectoral areas where they have development, where they're planning development, and helped them to understand in specific places where the choke points were of how they would have to allocate water in order to meet their development goals. So for the next 5-year development plan, they'll also be using this water data to start to set water demand and supply balance and development goals. So these are just 2 examples of what we need countries to be doing far more of. The last area is that we need to invest more in water resilience and more resilient infrastructure. And the first example of this is making more investments in both green or natural infrastructure and gray water infrastructure. So think about restoration of forested watersheds or protection of those to reduce landslides, to ensure water quality, to provide the slow release water supply system downstream to cities, in addition to also putting in filtration systems and pipes and pumps. We've done this work with the World Bank. You can see the report there, integrating green and gray. And what's interesting about this report has been that it's now being used as part of a training program for the program leads within the bank. And they just told us that they've seen a 20% increase in green water infrastructure investment, something around $2 billion in additional investment. So it shows me that if you make the case, if you provide calculators and tools, as we have with the World Bank, that can help people figure out how you actually do these kinds of nature-based solutions in concert with more traditional infrastructure, that we can make these kinds of shifts. And by the way, natural infrastructure is better buffered against extremes, too wet and too dry. So they're much smarter investments. They have better return on investment. The second area of resilience that we need to invest in is massively scaling water and energy recycling and reuse. And let me just point to the wastewater sector. In Europe today, a very small percentage of wastewater is actually treated, the water reused, and the energy from the biogas, from the methane in that wastewater treatment, used as an energy source. There's more energy in wastewater than is required to treat it. In many instances, you could take every wastewater treatment plant offline of the electricity system, and would allow you to run those treatment plants. In many instances, you can also, China's doing this, create compressed natural gas, which you can sell from everything in canisters to small restaurants, run taxis, municipal fleets of cars, and so on. The US EPA estimates that methane, that's 10% now of global methane production, will actually increase by 2030. This is a huge opportunity that is lying on the table, as it were. This is an example from my own wastewater treatment plant here in Washington, D.C. This system here is a PAMI system that's designed in Norway. They retrofitted it into their existing, very constrained wastewater treatment system. China, we actually did a study tour for China officials here. China is now doing this in 100 additional cities, and they're bringing in kitchen and other kinds of organic wastes into this circular economy approach. This is something that Europe should be doing everywhere. Last, we need to make more investments in water efficiency and agriculture on the cities and agriculture. On the agriculture side, lots and lots of data shows that we can improve water productivity of cropland. Let's say in rain-limited regions, we can feed an additional 110 million people. This is with rain-fed irrigation, with rain-fed agriculture. And we could provide water savings, that is water that is no longer needed, for 1.4 billion people if we manage to irrigate agriculture more effectively. So these are really significant amounts of value of return. Cities can do the same thing. Look at the example of during the really serious millennial drought in the 2000s in Australia, the worst drought on record. Sydney, because of and other cities in Australia, because of the measures that were undertaken to conserve and use water more effectively, now uses far less water than they did 30 years ago, even though they continue to grow in population and economic stature. To CDP, 59% of cities that report on activities that they're involved in on water and climate say that it's water risk that they're most worried about with their water supplies, but very few of them actually have a water management strategy. This is another thing that we need. This is another area that we can really make significant progress on. So just the last few reflections on EU policymakers that have gone on quite a while here. Thanks for your attention. I think there are three primary areas. The first is on risk assessment. We need to do what the UK is doing. We need to require companies, and for that matter, cities and others that are asking for loans, that are issuing debt, to set stronger climate and water financial risk criteria. We need to hold their feet to the fire to understand what those situations are that they may be facing. And it's a driver for investing in the right kinds of things. It helps to raise the visibility of the issue generally. In economic stimulus and in official development assistance overseas, we need to really fund water for starters. The Green Deal does not have much on water in it. Most of the investments so far globally in recovery and stimulus, first of all, are not green at all, and secondly, have very little associated with water in them, even though, in fact, those are really threshold questions with respect to climate impacts. We need to invest more in nature-based solutions, overseas as well as within Europe. And then this issue of wastewater recycling. It's such an incredible opportunity for capturing resources, energy, and reusing water that is otherwise very expensive to find elsewhere. Let me end by just saying, if you looked 15 years ago, we wouldn't have believed that we could make such a significant shift in energy as we have in Europe with renewables. More than doubling renewable share in 15 years. Europe really led the way. I think now we must do the same with water, and I think we can. Thanks very much. Appreciate the time and attention and look forward to your questions.